Most people believe strength is loud. They believe power comes from responding quickly, defending themselves in every argument, and proving their point whenever someone challenges them. The modern world rewards those who react fast, speak often, and make their presence known at every opportunity. But the ancient Stoics understood something far deeper about human nature and inner strength. The greatest power a person can develop is the ability not to react. Think about how many situations in your life are controlled by reaction. Someone criticizes you, and you immediately defend yourself. Someone provokes you, and you feel the urge to respond. Someone doubts you, and suddenly you want to prove them wrong. Without noticing, your peace of mind begins to depend on what other people say or do. Your emotional state becomes tied to forces outside your control. The Stoics warned about this long before the modern world existed. Epictetus taught that if someone can provoke your reaction, they already hold power over your mind. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 25, he explains that the moment we allow external events to disturb our inner state, we surrender control over ourselves. Now consider the opposite approach. Imagine someone criticizes you and you remain calm. Someone tries to provoke you and you observe instead of reacting. Someone doubts you, and you simply continue moving forward without the need to prove anything. Suddenly the situation changes. The person trying to disturb you loses control over the outcome. Silence becomes a form of strength. This is not weakness. This is not avoidance, it is discipline. It is the ability to pause between stimulus and response and choose the path that protects your mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 30, that the best way to respond to insult is to refuse to resemble the person who offered it. That lesson carries enormous weight. When you refuse to react impulsively, you stop participating in the emotional chaos that most people live inside every day. And here is the surprising truth. The more you learn to remain silent in the moments that normally trigger reaction, the stronger your mind becomes. Silence sharpens observation. Silence protects your energy. Silence reveals the intentions of others. And most importantly, silence builds the kind of inner control that cannot be shaken by opinions, criticism, or provocation. But there is something even more interesting. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. When you stop reacting the way they expect, the entire dynamic of the interaction changes. Suddenly, they begin to reveal more about themselves than they intended. The silent power. Most people ignore. Look around at the world for a moment and notice something curious. The loudest people are often the ones who seem the most eager to prove their strength. They speak quickly, they argue passionately, they react instantly to every criticism, every comment, every disagreement. It almost feels as if silence has become something suspicious. If someone says nothing, people assume weakness. If someone does not react, they assume defeat. But the Stoics observed human behavior carefully, and they discovered something that most people still fail to understand. Real strength rarely needs to announce itself. The ancient Stoics lived in a world just as chaotic as ours. Politics, conflict, ambition, rivalry, betrayal. Human nature has not changed much. What changed is the speed of reaction. Today, everything pushes you to respond immediately. A message arrives and you feel pressure to answer. Someone criticizes you, and your mind begins forming a defense before the person even finishes speaking. Someone doubts you, and suddenly you feel an urge to prove something. But pause for a moment and ask yourself a simple question. Who actually controls the situation in those moments? The person who provokes you or the person who remains calm? Epictetus spoke about this idea with brutal clarity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 18, he explained that when someone insults you, the insult itself is not what harms you. What harms you is the judgment you form about it. If you decide the insult matters, your mind becomes disturbed. If you decide it is insignificant, the words lose their power. This is where silence begins to reveal its hidden strength. Most people react because they believe reacting is necessary. They believe they must defend their image, their pride, their reputation. They believe that if they do not answer, they somehow lose status. But the Stoics understood that reacting too quickly is often a sign that someone else has gained influence over your mind. Think about how easily people can be pulled into arguments that never mattered in the first place. A comment turns into a debate. A disagreement turns into tension. A small criticism turns into hours of emotional disturbance. Energy is wasted, focus disappears, and peace of mind slowly dissolves. And for what reason? Often for nothing more than the fear of appearing weak. Marcus Aurelius reflected deeply on this during the immense pressures of ruling the Roman Empire. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, paragraph 63, he reminded himself that the best response to external disturbance is not immediate reaction, but control of one's own mind. His power did not come from responding to every voice around him. It came from mastering the space between event and response. That space is where silence lives. Silence gives you something reaction never can. It gives you perspective. When you do not rush to speak, your mind has time to observe what is actually happening. You begin to notice tone, intention, insecurity, emotion. You begin to see whether the situation deserves your energy or whether it is simply noise. Most of what disturbs people every day is noise. Noise from opinions, noise from provocation, noise from people who want attention, validation, or conflict. When someone has not trained their mind, they respond to every one of these signals as if it were important. Their emotions rise and fall depending on the behavior of others. But a disciplined mind begins to see something different. Not every comment deserves a reply. Not every insult deserves attention. Not every disagreement deserves participation. The moment you understand this, silence stops feeling uncomfortable. It begins to feel powerful. Silence creates space. In that space, you regain control over your thoughts, your emotions, and your decisions. You stop reacting automatically and start choosing deliberately. This is one of the first true forms of inner freedom, and something unexpected begins to happen. When you stop reacting the way people expect, the entire interaction changes. Those who try to provoke you lose their leverage. Those who seek conflict find no resistance. Those who expect emotional responses suddenly face calm observation instead. This confuses many people because they are used to controlling situations through reaction. But the Stoics knew that the strongest position is not always the loudest one. Sometimes the strongest position is quiet. Silence does not mean you have no answer. Silence means you are strong enough to decide whether the answer is worth giving. Silence means your peace of mind is not available for every random opinion that crosses your path. Silence means your mind belongs to you, and once you begin to understand this power, something inside you starts to change. Because what comes next is even more surprising. Many of the people who react the most aggressively are not strong at all. In fact, their reactions reveal something very different. Why the noisiest people often have the weakest minds. Once you begin paying attention, a strange pattern starts to appear in everyday life. The people who react the fastest are often the ones who feel the most threatened. They interrupt quickly, defend themselves immediately, argue loudly, and rush to prove that they are right. At first glance, this can look like confidence. It can look like strength. But when you observe carefully, something else becomes visible beneath the surface. The constant need to react often hides a fragile mind. A calm and disciplined person does not feel the same urgency to speak. They do not feel the need to correct every opinion or win every disagreement. Their sense of identity is not so easily shaken by what someone else says. Because of that, they can listen longer, observe more carefully, and respond only when it truly matters. But someone whose mind is unstable feels something very different. Every disagreement feels like a threat. Every criticism feels like an attack. Every opposing opinion feels like a challenge that must be defeated immediately. Their reactions are not coming from strength. They are coming from fear. Fear of losing status, fear of appearing weak, fear of not being respected. And fear is loud. The Stoics understood this aspect of human behavior long before modern psychology attempted to explain it. Seneca wrote extensively about the dangers of emotional impulsiveness. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 18, he warned that the mind that reacts quickly is often the mind that has not yet learned discipline. When emotions rush to the surface without reflection, judgment becomes clouded and control disappears. This is why the Stoics placed enormous importance on mastering one's reactions. When someone insults you and you react instantly, they have succeeded in entering your mind. They have placed their words inside your thoughts and forced your emotions to respond. In that moment, you are no longer fully directing your own mental state. Someone else has pulled the strings. Epictetus described this problem with remarkable clarity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18, he explained that when someone becomes angry at criticism, they reveal that their peace of mind depends on the opinions of others. If a person's tranquility can be disturbed by a stranger's words, then that tranquility was never firmly built in the first place. The disciplined mind behaves differently. Instead of reacting, it pauses. Instead of defending immediately, it observes. Instead of rushing to prove something, it evaluates whether the situation deserves attention at all. This pause may last only a few seconds, but those seconds reveal an enormous difference between a reactive mind and a trained one. Because in those seconds, control returns to you. You begin to see that many arguments are invitations to emotional chaos. Many provocations are attempts to pull you into someone else's insecurity. Many debates exist only to satisfy ego rather than pursue truth. The reactive mind cannot resist these invitations, but the disciplined mind simply watches them pass. Think about the people you truly respect in life, the individuals who appear steady, composed, and difficult to disturb. They rarely feel the need to speak over others. They do not rush to defend themselves at every small criticism. They allow conversations to unfold without trying to dominate them. This is not weakness. This is emotional independence. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that the behavior of others should never dictate the stability of his own mind. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 48, he wrote that the mind must remain upright on its own, not leaning on the approval or reaction of others. The person who needs to react constantly is leaning on validation, leaning on approval, leaning on the illusion of winning arguments. But the person who has trained their mind stands on their own. They understand that silence can be stronger than explanation, observation can be wiser than reaction, and patience can expose far more truth than argument ever could. Because something fascinating begins to happen when you stop reacting. People start revealing themselves. Those who crave conflict grow frustrated when no conflict appears. Those who seek attention become uncomfortable when their provocations receive no response. Those who depend on emotional reactions lose the control they expected to have. And in that moment, you begin to see human nature with far greater clarity. Which leads to the next realization. Speaking less does not make you invisible. In many situations, it makes you far more powerful. The psychological advantage of saying less. Once you understand that constant reaction often reveals insecurity, another powerful realization begins to emerge. Speaking less does not reduce your presence in a conversation. In many situations, it increases it. Most people believe influence comes from saying more, explaining more, defending more, and filling every silence with words. But human psychology works in a very different way. When someone speaks less, people listen more carefully. Silence creates attention. When every sentence is not immediately followed by another explanation, the mind of the listener becomes more alert. They begin to observe your tone, your posture, your expressions. Your words gain weight simply because they are not being scattered everywhere. Now compare this to the person who speaks constantly. When someone fills every space with opinions, explanations, and reactions, their words begin to lose value. The mind of the listener stops processing carefully because there is no scarcity. The voice becomes background noise rather than a signal worth focusing on. The Stoics understood the value of restraint not only as a form of discipline, but also as a form of clarity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 23, Epictetus advised his students to practice speaking only when what they were about to say was necessary and beneficial. Words that are chosen carefully carry far more power than words spoken impulsively. This principle changes the entire dynamic of interaction. When you stop trying to control conversations through constant speech, you begin to see more clearly what others reveal about themselves. People tend to fill silence. When there is a pause, many individuals feel uncomfortable and rush to speak. In that moment, they often expose their true thoughts, emotions, and intentions, The quiet observer gains information, the reactive speaker loses it. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to watch human behavior with calm attention. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he reminded himself to observe people without immediately judging or reacting. Observation sharpens understanding. Reaction interrupts it. When you allow silence to exist in conversation, your awareness expands. You notice hesitation in someone's voice. You notice tension in their expression. You notice the small shifts in tone that reveal whether someone speaks from honesty, insecurity, pride, or fear. This level of awareness is impossible when the mind is focused only on what it will say next. And this is where the psychological advantage begins to unfold. People who speak constantly often believe they are controlling the interaction. But in reality, they are revealing far more about themselves than they realize. Their impatience, their insecurity, their desire for approval, their need to dominate the conversation. All of it becomes visible to someone who simply observes. The quiet mind becomes a mirror. Others project themselves into that mirror without noticing. Seneca warned about the dangers of uncontrolled speech in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 104. He explained that those who speak excessively often lose the ability to examine their own thoughts. Words rush out before reflection has time to shape them. In contrast, a disciplined speaker allows thought to mature before expression. This patience transforms communication. When you finally speak, your words are deliberate. They are not driven by impulse or emotion. They are chosen with purpose. And because you have listened longer than others, your response often addresses the real issue rather than the superficial one. People notice this difference. A person who rarely speaks but chooses their words carefully gains a reputation for wisdom. Others begin to pay closer attention when that person finally decides to contribute to the conversation. Silence has prepared the ground for influence. But the benefit goes even deeper than social dynamics. When you reduce unnecessary speech, your mind becomes quieter as well. The urge to react begins to weaken. The need to prove something begins to fade. You start to feel less controlled by the opinions, provocations, and expectations of others. And this calm mental space allows you to see something that reactive people almost never notice. Many conflicts do not begin with disagreement. They begin with manipulation. And once you recognize that pattern, silence becomes more than a psychological advantage. It becomes protection. How silence breaks the cycle of manipulation. There is something about human behavior that most people only realize after many years of frustration. Not every conflict begins naturally. Many of them are created intentionally. Some people provoke, criticize, question, or challenge, not because they seek truth, but because they seek a reaction. Reaction gives them energy. Reaction gives them control. Reaction pulls you into a game that you never intended to play. And the moment you react, the game begins. Think about how often this happens in ordinary life. Someone says something slightly insulting. Someone questions your ability. Someone makes a comment designed to irritate you. Instantly, your mind prepares a response. Your emotions rise. Your words come faster. And suddenly you are involved in a situation that did not exist just moments earlier. This is the cycle of manipulation. The person who provokes creates the stimulus. The person who reacts completes the cycle. Without the reaction, the cycle cannot continue. Without the emotional response, the attempt at manipulation loses its power. This is why silence is one of the most effective ways to break that cycle. The Stoics understood that control over reaction was the foundation of freedom. Epictetus explained this principle repeatedly to his students. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 29, he reminded them that the greatest mistake people make is allowing external events to dictate their internal state. When you allow someone else's behavior to control your emotions, you surrender authority over your own mind. But when you remain silent, something remarkable happens. The manipulation fails. The person expecting anger receives calm observation instead. The person expecting a defensive explanation receives quiet composure. The person expecting an argument encounters stillness. In that moment, the emotional leverage they hope to gain disappears. Most manipulators depend entirely on reaction. Without it, they are left with nothing. This is why many people become uncomfortable when they face someone who refuses to react. The silence forces them to confront their own behavior. Their attempt to provoke hangs in the air without support. The dynamic that normally gives them control begins to collapse. Seneca described this kind of emotional independence as one of the greatest forms of personal strength. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 71, he explained that the person who cannot be provoked possesses a kind of freedom that no external force can easily disturb. Their peace of mind does not depend on the behavior of others, and once you understand this, you begin to see manipulation everywhere. You see it in arguments designed to make you defend yourself endlessly. You see it in conversations where someone twists your words in order to provoke frustration. You see it in situations where a person attempts to trigger guilt, anger, or insecurity just to gain influence over your decisions. All of these strategies rely on the same mechanism. They require your emotional participation. Silence removes that participation. When you remain calm and refuse to react impulsively, you step outside the emotional game entirely. Instead of becoming entangled in someone else's motives, you observe them from a distance. You begin to recognize patterns that once went unnoticed. You start to see who genuinely seeks understanding and who simply seeks control. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that other people's actions reflect their own character, not yours. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 9, paragraph 42, he reflected that when someone behaves unjustly, it reveals something about their nature. Your responsibility is not to react in kind, but to remain aligned with your own principles. Silence helps protect those principles. It gives you time to think before responding. It prevents emotions from rushing into decisions. It allows wisdom to guide your actions rather than impulse. And perhaps most importantly, it sends a quiet message to the people around you. Your mind is not easily controlled. Once others begin to recognize that your reactions cannot be manipulated, something shifts in the way they approach you. The attempts to provoke become weaker. The emotional traps lose effectiveness. Respect begins to replace provocation. But silence alone is not enough. To use it wisely, you must also learn another discipline that the Stoics considered essential. The discipline of controlling your own words. The Stoic discipline of restraining your tongue. Most people think self-control begins with actions. They believe discipline is about what you do, how you behave, or how you respond to challenges. But the Stoics understood that one of the hardest forms of discipline lives much closer than that. It lives in the mouth. It lives in the moment when a thought forms and the urge to speak appears. Controlling the tongue is one of the clearest signs that someone has begun to master their own mind. Words move faster than reflection. A thought appears, emotion attaches itself to it, and before awareness fully arrives, the words escape. A sharp response, a defensive explanation, an unnecessary argument, a careless comment, and in a matter of seconds, something small becomes something much larger. The Stoics knew that most trouble in human relationships begins not with actions, but with speech that escaped before wisdom had time to guide it. Epictetus spoke about this with direct simplicity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 12, he warned that a person who cannot control their speech has not yet learned to control themselves. The impulse to speak immediately reveals a mind that still reacts before it thinks, and a reactive mind will constantly create problems that discipline could have prevented. Think about how many arguments in life begin with just one unnecessary sentence, a sarcastic remark, a defensive explanation, a criticism spoken without patience, a reaction spoken before understanding. In those moments, speech becomes the doorway through which emotion escapes. This is why the Stoics practiced restraint in conversation. They believed that words should pass through a filter before entering the world, a moment of pause, a brief reflection, a simple question asked internally. Does this need to be said? Does this improve the situation? Does this serve wisdom or simply serve ego? Most of the time, the honest answer is clear. Silence would have been better. Seneca reflected deeply on this discipline throughout his writings. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 52, he explained that the mind that rushes to speak often reveals its immaturity. True wisdom does not hurry. It waits, evaluates, and chooses its expression carefully. A disciplined mind understands that every word carries consequence. Once spoken, words cannot return, and when people fail to practice restraint, they often discover that the damage created by speech lasts far longer than the moment that produced it. A careless comment may echo in someone's memory for years. A defensive reaction may create distance between people who once trusted each other. A heated argument may plant resentment that slowly grows over time. All of this begins with the same mistake: speaking before thinking. The Stoic approach reverses this pattern. Instead of letting emotion lead speech, the disciplined mind allows reflection to lead expression. A pause appears between thought and word. In that pause, the mind regains control. Marcus Aurelius trained himself constantly in this kind of restraint. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, paragraph 24, he reminded himself that unnecessary words disturb the mind just as much as unnecessary actions. Speaking less was not simply a social skill, it was a form of inner order. When speech becomes disciplined, the mind becomes calmer as well. You begin to notice that many situations do not require your voice. Many conversations do not require your opinion. Many provocations do not deserve your explanation. The urge to speak begins to weaken because you recognize that silence often protects peace more effectively than words. And something important begins to develop within you: authority. Not the authority that comes from dominating conversations, but the quiet authority that comes from self-control. When you speak less frequently, people listen more carefully. When you do not react impulsively, others begin to recognize that your words are chosen rather than scattered. Over time, your voice gains weight. But even more importantly, your mind gains stability. Because once you learn to restrain your tongue, you begin to notice another transformation happening quietly inside you. The impulse to react weakens. The space between stimulus and response becomes wider. Your emotions no longer rush forward with the same urgency. And in that growing space, another kind of strength begins to form. The strength that lives behind calm reactions. The strength hidden behind calm reactions. Most people believe strength is visible in intensity. They imagine that power appears through forceful responses, loud arguments, and immediate reactions. When someone challenges them, they feel pressure to respond quickly, as if silence would mean defeat. But the Stoics observed human behavior closely, and they reached a very different conclusion. True strength often appears in the person who reacts the least. A calm reaction is not a passive response, it is a controlled response. When someone reacts impulsively, their behavior is driven by emotion: anger, pride, insecurity, frustration. These forces rush through the mind and push words out before reason has time to examine them. In that moment, the person is not directing the situation. The emotion is directing them. But a calm reaction reveals something else entirely. It reveals that the mind has paused long enough to examine what is happening. It shows that the person has stepped back from the immediate emotional impulse and chosen to respond deliberately. That pause may last only a few seconds, but those seconds represent a powerful difference between a reactive mind and a disciplined one. The Stoics believed that the space between stimulus and response is where freedom lives. Epictetus explained this principle clearly to his students. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 20, he reminded them that events themselves do not disturb people. What disturbs people is their interpretation of those events. When someone reacts immediately, they accept their first emotional interpretation as truth. But when someone pauses, they give reason an opportunity to examine the situation. Often the situation is far less important than the emotion initially suggested. A criticism that felt like an attack may simply be someone's frustration. A comment that sounded insulting may have been careless rather than malicious. A disagreement that appears threatening may simply be a difference in perspective. But when people react without reflection, they never discover this. They escalate situations that could have disappeared with patience. This is why calm reactions create strength. A calm mind remains capable of understanding the situation instead of becoming trapped inside it. While others are carried away by emotion, the calm observer continues to see clearly. Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline constantly while leading an empire filled with pressure, conflict, and criticism. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 11, paragraph 18, he reminded himself that the best defense against anger is patience. When someone behaves badly, your reaction determines whether their behavior spreads into your own character. If you respond with anger, you multiply the problem. If you respond with calm control, the disturbance ends with them. This principle changes the way interactions unfold. When someone expects anger and receives calmness instead, their emotional momentum loses force. The argument they prepared for suddenly has no opponent. The reaction they anticipated never arrives. And the dynamic shifts. Many people rely on emotional escalation to maintain control in conversations. They raise their voice, intensify their tone, and expect others to follow the same pattern. But when someone remains calm, the escalation stops climbing. The situation stabilizes. Calmness introduces gravity. It pulls emotional chaos back toward balance. Seneca wrote extensively about this kind of inner stability. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 85, he explained that the wise person is not someone who never encounters provocation. The wise person is someone who refuses to surrender their composure when provocation appears. This distinction is crucial. The Stoic does not live in a peaceful world. They live in the same unpredictable environment as everyone else. They face criticism, misunderstanding, disagreement and pressure. But they train their mind so that these external events do not dictate their internal state. Their calmness becomes a form of quiet authority. People begin to sense that emotional tactics do not work against them. Provocation loses effectiveness. Arguments lose intensity. Even those who initially seek conflict often soften their tone when faced with someone who remains composed, because calm reactions create a subtle form of influence. When others see that you are not controlled by emotional impulses, they begin to recognize that your behavior comes from deliberate choice. Your stability creates contrast with their agitation. Your patience exposes their impatience, and in that contrast, respect begins to grow. But calm reactions require something deeper than silence alone. They require awareness. You must learn to see what is happening before you decide how to respond. And that awareness begins with a simple habit that many people rarely practice. Learning to observe before speaking. Why observing before speaking changes everything. Most people enter conversations with their attention already pointed toward one thing, what they are about to say. While the other person speaks, the mind begins preparing a response. It searches for arguments, defenses, explanations, or clever remarks. The ears hear the words, but the mind is already busy constructing its reply. Because of this, a great deal of what is actually happening in the interaction goes completely unnoticed. The Stoics trained themselves to reverse this habit. Instead of rushing to speak, they practiced observing first. Observation creates distance between the situation and your reaction. In that distance, your mind begins to gather information that a reactive person would miss entirely. Tone of voice, hesitation, insecurity, intention, frustration, pride. All of these signals appear quietly within a conversation, but they can only be noticed when the mind is not distracted by the urgency to respond. This simple shift changes everything. When you observe first, you stop reacting to the surface of a conversation and begin to understand the deeper forces behind it. A harsh comment might come from stress rather than hostility. A sharp tone might come from insecurity rather than disrespect. A disagreement might come from confusion rather than opposition. But someone who speaks too quickly never sees these things. Their reaction arrives before their understanding. Epictetus often reminded his students that wisdom begins with learning to perceive things accurately. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 26, he explained that many disturbances in life come from misunderstanding what is truly happening. When the mind reacts too quickly, it replaces observation with assumption, and assumptions are dangerous guides. Observation slows the process down. It allows reason to enter before emotion takes control. When someone speaks, you begin to listen not only to their words, but also to the intention behind them. You notice how their expression shifts when they say certain things. You notice when their voice grows tense or uncertain. These small details reveal far more truth than the words themselves. Marcus Aurelius practiced this habit constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 53, he reminded himself to examine situations carefully before responding. A person who reacts without understanding behaves like someone moving through darkness, but the person who observes patiently begins to see the structure of the moment. And once you see clearly, your response becomes far more effective. Sometimes observation reveals that nothing needs to be said at all. What initially looked like a challenge turns out to be someone's moment of frustration. What appeared to be criticism turns out to be misunderstanding. Silence becomes the most intelligent response because speaking would only create unnecessary conflict. Other times, observation shows that a thoughtful response is needed. But because you have taken time to understand the situation, your words arrive with precision rather than impulse. You address the real issue instead of reacting to the emotional surface. People notice this difference immediately. When someone speaks after observing carefully, their words feel grounded. They do not sound defensive or aggressive. They sound measured. Their tone carries clarity rather than tension, and because their response reflects understanding rather than emotion, it often calms the situation instead of intensifying it. Seneca warned about the dangers of speaking before the mind has examined what is happening. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 47, he explained that the wise person observes human behavior carefully before deciding how to respond. Without observation, speech becomes guesswork guided by emotion, and emotion is rarely a reliable guide. When you begin practicing this discipline, conversations start to feel different. You no longer feel rushed. You no longer feel pressured to defend yourself immediately. You realize that silence during a conversation is not awkward. It is simply space for awareness to grow. In that space, your mind becomes calmer. You begin to see patterns in people. You recognize when someone is seeking conflict and when someone is seeking understanding. You notice when a conversation is worth entering and when it is wiser to let it pass. This awareness gives you something most reactive people never develop: choice. You are no longer being pushed from reaction to reaction. You are deciding how much energy the situation deserves, and in many cases, the answer becomes surprisingly simple: very little. Because once you learn to observe before speaking, another realization appears. Most conversations that drain your mind were never worth your energy in the first place, which leads to another lesson the Stoics understood deeply. Silence is not only a tool for awareness, it is also protection for your mental energy. Silence as a shield for your mental energy. One of the things people rarely notice about modern life is how much mental energy is constantly being drained by unnecessary reactions. Every day, the mind is pulled in dozens of directions. Messages demand attention. Opinions invite response. Criticism invites defense. Arguments invite participation. Without realizing it, people spend enormous amounts of energy responding to situations that never truly deserved their focus. The Stoics recognized this long before the modern world multiplied these distractions. They understood that the mind possesses a limited reserve of attention and emotional strength. When that reserve is spent on trivial conflicts, pointless arguments, and constant reactions, very little remains for the things that actually matter. Silence becomes a shield that protects this reserve. When you refuse to react to every opinion, every provocation, every disagreement, you begin conserving mental energy. The mind no longer jumps from disturbance to disturbance. Instead of being scattered across dozens of emotional responses, your attention becomes more stable and more deliberate. This shift creates a powerful sense of clarity. Epictetus explained that a disciplined person must learn to separate what deserves attention from what does not. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 4, Chapter 4, he reminded his students that many of the things people become upset about are outside their control and therefore unworthy of emotional investment. When the mind reacts to everything, it becomes exhausted by problems that never belonged to it in the first place. Silence helps create that separation. When someone offers an opinion about you, silence allows you to ask a simple question internally. Does this opinion change who I am or what I must do? In most cases, the honest answer is no. Yet many people spend hours defending themselves against words that carry no real authority over their lives. When someone invites you into an argument, Silence creates a moment of evaluation. Is this discussion seeking truth or simply feeding ego? Many arguments exist only to satisfy the pride of those involved. Participating in them drains energy while producing no wisdom. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that attention must be guarded carefully. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 3, paragraph 4, he reflected that a person should focus only on what is necessary and meaningful. When the mind becomes distracted by countless trivial matters, it loses the clarity required for good judgment. This is exactly what happens when people react constantly. Their attention becomes fragmented. Their emotions rise and fall with every new comment, every disagreement, every criticism. Instead of directing their mental energy toward growth, learning, and purposeful action, they spend it defending themselves against temporary disturbances. Silence interrupts this pattern. When you stop reacting to everything, your mind begins to recover its stability. The emotional turbulence created by constant engagement starts to fade. You begin to notice that many situations resolve themselves without your involvement. Conflicts disappear when they are not fed by reaction. Opinions lose importance when they are not given attention. Your energy returns to you. Seneca described this kind of mental economy as a key part of living wisely. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 2, he warned that the mind must not be scattered across countless distractions. A person who gives their attention to everything ultimately possesses it nowhere. But the person who guards their attention carefully builds a mind capable of depth and stability. Silence is one of the most effective ways to guard that attention. It allows you to remain present without becoming entangled. You can hear what others say without absorbing every emotional charge attached to their words. You can witness disagreement without feeling obligated to enter it. You can recognize criticism without letting it disturb your direction. This kind of detachment does not make you indifferent, it makes you selective. You begin choosing where your energy goes instead of allowing others to decide for you. Conversations become calmer, your thoughts become clearer, decisions become easier, because your mind is no longer clouded by dozens of unnecessary reactions. And something else begins to change as well. When people realize that your mind is not easily pulled into emotional turbulence, they begin to see you differently. The need to defend yourself fades. The urge to explain yourself fades. The desire to prove something fades, because a deeper form of confidence begins to take shape. A confidence that no longer depends on the approval or validation of others. The confidence that does not need validation. One of the quiet transformations that happens when someone practices silence and restraint is the gradual disappearance of a powerful psychological habit, the habit of seeking validation. Many people spend a large part of their lives trying to confirm their value through the reactions of others. They want their opinions accepted, their achievements recognized, their choices approved, and their identity affirmed. Because of this, every disagreement feels uncomfortable, and every criticism feels threatening. When someone depends on validation, silence becomes difficult. They feel the urge to explain themselves. They feel the need to correct misunderstandings. They feel pressure to defend their decisions so that others will see them in the right light. Without realizing it, their peace of mind becomes tied to how others perceive them. The Stoics saw this dependence as a dangerous form of vulnerability. Epictetus warned his students about this tendency repeatedly. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 3, Chapter 22, he explained that the moment a person seeks approval from others as a source of confidence, they place their tranquility in the hands of strangers. If someone else's opinion determines whether you feel secure or insecure, then your emotional stability is no longer under your control. Silence begins to break this dependency. When you stop reacting to every opinion and stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, you discover that your identity does not collapse when others disagree with you. You begin to notice that many opinions carry far less weight than you once believed. People speak from their own experiences, their own insecurities, their own limited perspectives. Their approval is not a reliable measurement of your worth. Marcus Aurelius reflected deeply on this idea during moments of self-examination. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 12, paragraph 4, He reminded himself that the opinions of others are temporary and unstable. What truly matters is whether one's actions align with reason and virtue, not whether they receive applause. This perspective slowly reshapes the way you interact with the world. Instead of speaking to gain approval, you speak when something meaningful needs to be said. Instead of defending yourself constantly, you allow your actions to stand on their own. Instead of reacting to criticism with urgency, you evaluate whether the criticism contains truth or simply reflects someone else's perspective. In many cases, silence becomes the clearest response. Because when someone no longer seeks validation, they also stop fearing disapproval. The fear that once pushed them to explain themselves begins to fade. They realize that disagreement does not diminish their character and that criticism does not define their direction. Confidence grows quietly in that realization. Seneca described this kind of confidence as independence of the mind. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 76, he explained that the wise person measures their worth by their own conduct rather than by the approval of others. External praise and external criticism both become less influential when someone develops an internal standard. Silence helps strengthen that internal standard. Every time you choose not to defend yourself unnecessarily, you reinforce the understanding that your value does not depend on winning approval. Every time you allow disagreement to exist without reacting, you train your mind to remain stable in the presence of different opinions. Over time, this practice builds a powerful kind of confidence. It is not loud confidence that demands attention. It is not fragile confidence that requires constant reassurance. It is quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. And when people encounter someone with that kind of stability, something interesting happens. They begin to treat that person differently. Because a mind that does not seek validation also does not waste energy on every conflict. It begins to choose carefully where attention should go and where silence is wiser. This leads to one of the most practical lessons the Stoics practiced throughout their lives: learning to choose which battles are actually worth fighting. The Stoic art of choosing your battles. One of the most important realizations that comes with discipline of the mind is understanding that not every battle deserves your energy. Many people move through life as if every disagreement must be confronted, every criticism must be answered, and every challenge must be defeated. They treat daily interactions like a series of small wars that must be won in order to protect their pride. But the Stoics saw something dangerous in this mentality. A person who fights every battle eventually becomes exhausted. Energy that could have been directed toward growth, purpose, and meaningful action becomes scattered across countless minor conflicts. Arguments about opinions, debates that lead nowhere, emotional disputes that produce no wisdom. In the end, the person who reacts to everything slowly loses the strength needed for the moments that truly matter. The Stoic approach was very different. Instead of reacting to every challenge, the disciplined mind learns to ask a simple question before engaging. Does this situation deserve my energy? That question alone changes everything. Epictetus encouraged his students to evaluate situations carefully before responding. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 10, he explained that the wise person does not rush into every dispute. Instead, they examine whether the matter concerns something meaningful or something trivial. If the situation touches virtue, justice, or truth, it may deserve attention. If it is driven by pride, ego, or provocation, it is often wiser to walk away. This is not avoidance. It is strategic discipline. Marcus Aurelius practiced this perspective constantly while navigating the immense pressures of leadership. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, Paragraph 20, he reminded himself that many things people argue about are insignificant in the greater structure of life. A mind that becomes disturbed by every small conflict will never remain stable long enough to pursue wisdom. Choosing your battles protects that stability. Imagine how different daily life becomes when this discipline is applied consistently. Someone criticizes a minor decision you made. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause and examine the situation. Will answering this criticism improve anything? Will the discussion produce clarity, or will it simply feed disagreement? Often the answer becomes clear. Silence is the wiser choice. Another person tries to provoke you in conversation, hoping to draw you into an argument. Instead of defending yourself emotionally, you recognize the attempt and refuse to participate. Without your reaction, the conflict loses its momentum. Your energy remains intact. Seneca spoke about the importance of preserving strength for meaningful struggles. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 14, he warned that a person who engages in endless minor disputes eventually weakens their own character. The wise person directs effort only towards situations that contribute to virtue or understanding. This discipline creates a remarkable sense of calm. When you stop treating every disagreement as a battle, life becomes quieter. Conversations feel less tense. Your mind no longer anticipates conflict around every corner. You begin to recognize that most daily friction is temporary and unimportant. And something interesting happens when you apply this approach consistently. People begin to notice that you are difficult to provoke. They realize that attempts to draw you into unnecessary conflict rarely succeed. Your reactions are measured. Your responses are deliberate. Your silence appears where others would have erupted into argument. This creates a quiet form of respect. Not the respect that comes from intimidation, but the respect that grows around someone who clearly understands the value of their own attention. Others begin to see that your words are not given freely to every situation. They are reserved for moments that truly deserve them. And because of this, when you finally decide to speak, something important happens. Your words begin to carry more weight than before. Why silence makes your words more powerful? When someone speaks constantly, their words begin to lose their weight. The mind of the listener slowly stops distinguishing between what is important and what is unnecessary. Everything blends together. Opinions, explanations, reactions, arguments. The more frequently words appear, the less attention they receive. This is a quiet psychological law that most people never notice. Scarcity creates value. The Stoics understood that restraint gives strength not only to the mind, but also to speech. When a person speaks rarely and thoughtfully, their words gain a different presence in a conversation. People listen more carefully because they know that what is about to be said has been considered before it was spoken. Silence prepares the ground for meaningful speech. Epictetus taught that the purpose of speech is not to display intelligence or dominate discussion. The purpose of speech is to communicate something useful or truthful. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 3, Chapter 1, he reminded his students that words should be chosen with care, because careless speech reveals a careless mind. A disciplined speaker becomes selective. They do not rush to comment on everything. They do not feel compelled to correct every mistake they hear. They do not interrupt every opinion with their own perspective. Instead, they listen longer, think more deeply, and wait for the moment when their words can actually contribute something valuable. This patience changes how others perceive them. When someone who normally speaks little finally enters the conversation, the room becomes quieter. Attention shifts. People become curious about what this person has chosen to say. The same sentence spoken by someone who talks endlessly might be ignored. But when spoken by someone known for restraint, the sentence carries authority. Marcus Aurelius reflected on the importance of meaningful speech while training himself in self-discipline. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 30, he reminded himself that unnecessary words disturb both the speaker and the listener. Speaking only what is necessary keeps the mind ordered and the conversation clear. This principle applies far beyond philosophical discussion. In daily life, people quickly notice when someone speaks only when it matters. A manager who rarely raises their voice gains more attention when they finally do. A friend who does not complain constantly is taken more seriously when they express concern. A person who does not argue frequently carries more influence when they choose to challenge something. Silence builds credibility. Seneca warned that people who speak excessively often dilute their own influence. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 40, he explained that a wise person should value precision in speech rather than abundance. Words that appear rarely and with intention possess far greater impact than those scattered impulsively. This understanding transforms communication. Instead of measuring conversations by how much you say, you begin measuring them by how meaningful your contribution is. One clear sentence may carry more value than 10 emotional reactions. A calm observation may resolve a conflict that dozens of arguments could not settle. Silence strengthens this ability. When you spend more time listening than speaking, your mind gathers more information. Your understanding becomes deeper. Your words become more precise because they are based on observation rather than assumption. People feel this difference immediately. They sense that your responses come from reflection rather than impulse. Your tone becomes calmer. Your statements become clearer. And because you do not compete for attention through constant speech, your words naturally rise above the noise. Over time, your voice develops quiet authority. But something even more important is happening beneath the surface. While others are still reacting impulsively, you are building a different kind of transformation inside your own mind. Silence is not only shaping the way others hear you, it is shaping the person you are becoming. The inner transformation that comes from quiet discipline. At first, practicing silence may feel like a social skill. It may seem like a strategy to avoid arguments, to maintain composure, or to communicate more effectively. But over time, something deeper begins to happen. Silence stops being just a behavior. It becomes a transformation of the mind itself. The Stoics understood that discipline practiced externally eventually reshapes the internal world. Every time you resist the urge to react impulsively, something inside you becomes stronger. Every time you pause instead of speaking immediately, the mind learns patience. Every time you allow a situation to pass without emotional escalation, the mind becomes less dependent on external circumstances. This process happens quietly, but its effects are profound. At the beginning, the urge to react feels powerful. Someone criticizes you, and the impulse to defend yourself rises instantly. Someone provokes you, and the mind wants to respond with equal intensity. But when you practice restraint again and again, that impulse slowly weakens. You begin to notice that what once felt urgent no longer feels important. Epictetus described this transformation as the training of the inner faculty of judgment. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 1, he explained that the most important task in life is learning how to examine impressions before accepting them. When something happens, the mind forms an immediate interpretation, but wisdom requires examining that interpretation before acting on it. Silence creates the space for that examination. Without silence, impressions rush directly into reactions. With silence, impressions must pass through reflection. Over time, this habit strengthens the mind's ability to distinguish between what truly deserves attention and what should simply be ignored. Marcus Aurelius practiced this internal discipline constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, Paragraph 16, he reminded himself that the mind becomes shaped by the thoughts it repeatedly entertains. When someone reacts constantly to every disturbance, their mind becomes restless and easily agitated. But when someone practices calm observation, their mind gradually becomes steadier. Silence trains that steadiness. The more you practice it, the less you feel controlled by external events. Situations that once created frustration begin to lose their emotional intensity. Words that once felt offensive begin to appear insignificant. Opinions that once disturbed your confidence begin to lose their influence. The mind becomes less reactive and more stable. Seneca described this kind of stability as one of the greatest achievements of philosophical practice. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 59, he explained that the disciplined mind is not constantly shaken by circumstances. Instead, it develops an inner center that remains steady even when the world around it becomes chaotic. Silence helps build that center. When you refuse to react impulsively, you reclaim authority over your own thoughts. You are no longer carried away by every emotional wave that passes through your environment. Instead, you observe those waves without allowing them to determine your direction. And with each moment of restraint, the mind becomes stronger. Gradually, you begin to notice that peace no longer depends on controlling what others say or do. Peace comes from controlling the way your own mind responds. This realization changes how you move through the world. Situations that once demanded your emotional involvement now appear distant and manageable. You become less fragile, less vulnerable to opinion, less dependent on approval. And this quiet strength creates something that the Stoics valued deeply: resilience. Because when the mind learns not to react impulsively in small situations, it becomes far more capable of remaining steady in difficult ones. The discipline built through silence prepares the mind for challenges that truly test character. Over time, this training produces a remarkable result: a mind that cannot be easily shaken. How silence builds an unshakable mind. There is a reason the Stoics practiced discipline in the smallest moments of daily life. They understood that the mind does not suddenly become strong when a crisis appears. Strength is built long before the crisis arrives. It is built in ordinary situations, in small provocations, in moments where the mind chooses patience instead of reaction. Every time you choose silence over impulse, you are training the stability of your mind. At first, these moments may seem insignificant. Someone says something irritating and you decide not to respond. Someone doubts you and you allow the comment to pass without defending yourself. Someone attempts to provoke you and you remain calm instead of entering the conflict. Individually, these situations appear small, but each one strengthens the mind's resistance to emotional disturbance. The Stoics believed that emotional reactions function like habits. The more frequently a person reacts with anger, frustration, or defensiveness, the more natural those reactions become. The mind becomes conditioned to respond automatically, without reflection. But the opposite is also true. When someone practices restraint repeatedly, calmness begins to replace impulsiveness. The mind learns a new pattern. Epictetus explained that a disciplined life requires constant training of one's responses. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 3, Chapter 12, he compared the development of character to physical training. Just as muscles become stronger through repeated exercise, the mind becomes stronger through repeated acts of self-control. Silence becomes one of the most powerful forms of that training. Each moment of restraint expands the distance between external events and internal reactions. Instead of being pushed immediately by emotion, the mind gains time to examine what is happening. With that examination comes clarity. With clarity comes control. Over time, this process creates remarkable emotional stability. Situations that once disturbed you deeply begin to feel manageable. Criticism loses its ability to trigger frustration. Provocation loses its ability to trigger anger. Even unexpected difficulties become easier to face because the mind has already learned how to remain steady in smaller disturbances. Marcus Aurelius understood this principle well while leading through periods of immense pressure. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, Paragraph 54, he reminded himself that the mind can remain strong when it refuses to be carried away by external events. The disturbance does not come from the situation itself, but from the reaction the mind chooses to produce. Silence interrupts that reaction. When you pause instead of reacting, the disturbance loses its momentum. The mind no longer feeds the emotional response that would normally grow larger. Instead, the situation appears in its true size, often much smaller than it first seemed. This perspective gradually creates resilience. Resilience is not the absence of difficulty. It is the ability to remain steady in the presence of difficulty. A resilient mind does not collapse under criticism, pressure, or disagreement. It observes the situation, evaluates it calmly, and responds with reason instead of impulse. Seneca described this stability as one of the highest achievements of personal discipline. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 78, he explained that the wise person develops a mind that remains firm regardless of changing circumstances. External events may rise and fall, but the inner structure of the mind remains balanced. Silence plays a crucial role in building that structure. By refusing to react impulsively, you train your mind to stay centered. Emotional storms may pass around you, but they no longer carry you with them. Instead of becoming entangled in every disturbance, you learn to observe them as temporary movements in the world. And with each experience, your mind grows steadier. Eventually, others begin to notice this stability. While many people are pulled into emotional conflict easily, you remain composed. While others react with intensity, you respond with patience. Your calmness becomes visible in the way you listen, the way you speak, and the way you handle pressure. This calm presence creates a quiet form of influence. Because when someone remains steady while others lose control, people begin to recognize a different kind of strength. Not the strength of force or argument, but the strength of inner balance. And that balance creates something powerful in the eyes of others. Respect. The quiet presence that commands respect. There is a kind of respect that cannot be demanded and cannot be forced. It does not come from authority, loudness, or dominance. It appears naturally around people who demonstrate something rare in human behavior: control over themselves. When someone learns to remain calm, measured, and silent when necessary, their presence begins to change the atmosphere around them. People feel it even before they understand it. Most individuals are used to interacting with minds that react quickly. Conversations often become contests of opinions, arguments become louder over time, and disagreements escalate because both sides feel the need to defend themselves immediately. But when someone enters that environment with calm observation instead of reaction, the dynamic shifts. Silence introduces stability. The person who does not rush to speak appears grounded. The person who listens fully before responding appears thoughtful. The person who refuses to react emotionally to provocation appears strong. These qualities create a quiet authority that others instinctively recognize. The Stoics valued this form of presence because it reflected a mind that had learned to govern itself. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that true dignity comes from maintaining one's character regardless of the behavior of others. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, paragraph 15, he reflected that the best response to disrespect is to refuse to imitate it. When someone remains calm in the face of agitation, they reveal discipline rather than weakness. This discipline becomes visible in subtle ways. A calm person does not interrupt constantly. They do not rush to correct every statement. They allow conversations to unfold while observing carefully. When they finally speak, their words arrive with clarity rather than emotional force. People begin to trust that kind of voice. Seneca described this effect when discussing the character of a wise individual. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 64, he explained that the person who governs their own emotions radiates a form of stability that others naturally respect. Their composure signals that they are not easily influenced by anger, pride, or fear. This stability becomes especially noticeable in moments of tension. When a disagreement appears and emotions rise, most people become louder. They attempt to defend their position through intensity, but the individual who remains calm does not compete in that escalation. Their tone remains steady, their posture remains relaxed, their response appears deliberate rather than impulsive. This contrast is powerful. The louder voices begin to sound less convincing when placed next to someone who is calm and precise. Emotional arguments lose their strength when they meet quiet clarity. Even those who initially seek confrontation often soften their approach when faced with someone who refuses to enter emotional conflict. Over time, this pattern creates a reputation. People begin to recognize that your presence brings calm rather than chaos. They see that you do not react impulsively. They understand that your words are not driven by ego or anger. Because of this, they listen more carefully when you speak, and they respect the boundaries you maintain. This respect grows naturally. It does not come from trying to impress others or dominate discussions. It comes from the visible evidence that you have trained your own mind. In a world where many people struggle to control their reactions, the person who can remain steady becomes rare, and rarity attracts attention. But the Stoics never practiced this discipline for the sake of admiration. Their goal was not to appear wise or respected. Their goal was to achieve something far more important: mastery over themselves. Because in the end, silence, patience, and restraint are not about controlling how others see you. They are about controlling how you respond to the world. And that realization leads directly to the most important lesson of all. The Stoic truth: mastering yourself is the ultimate strength. At the end of all these lessons, one truth stands above the rest. The Stoics never practiced silence simply to win arguments, appear wiser, or gain respect from others. Those things may happen along the way, but they were never the true objective. The real purpose of this discipline was something far deeper: to master the only thing that truly belongs to you, your mind. Most people spend their lives trying to control what cannot be controlled. They try to control how others see them. They try to control opinions, outcomes, reputations, and the behavior of those around them. When these things move in unexpected directions, frustration appears, anger appears, anxiety appears. The mind becomes unstable because it depends on forces that were never within its authority. The Stoics saw this struggle clearly. Epictetus taught his students that peace begins the moment a person understands the difference between what belongs to them and what does not. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 1, he explained that our judgments, choices, and responses belong to us. Everything else, the actions of others, the opinions of strangers, the events of the world, exists outside our control. Silence helps protect that boundary. When someone insults you and you react instantly, you allow their words to enter your mind and disturb it. When someone criticizes you and you rush to defend yourself emotionally, their opinion begins shaping your internal state. But when you remain calm and deliberate, the boundary remains intact. Your mind stays yours. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this constantly while carrying the enormous responsibility of ruling an empire. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, Paragraph 30, he reminded himself that the mind can remain free even in difficult circumstances if it refuses to surrender its judgment to external disturbances. Freedom of the mind was the Stoic goal. Not freedom from difficulty, not freedom from criticism, not freedom from disagreement. Those things are part of life and cannot be avoided, but freedom from being controlled by them is possible. Silence becomes one of the strongest tools for protecting that freedom. When you pause before reacting, you reclaim authority over your response. When you listen instead of arguing, you maintain clarity instead of feeding emotion. When you choose not to defend yourself against every opinion, you prevent your peace of mind from becoming dependent on approval. Gradually, the mind becomes stronger. Seneca described this strength as the foundation of a tranquil life. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 9, he explained that the person who governs their own thoughts becomes independent of the chaos surrounding them. External events may still occur, but they no longer dictate the direction of the mind. And that independence is the true power the Stoics pursued, not the power to silence others, not the power to dominate discussions, but the power to remain steady while the world moves unpredictably around them. When someone masters this discipline, something remarkable happens. The need to prove anything disappears. The urge to react fades. The fear of criticism weakens. The mind becomes quieter, clearer, and far more stable. From the outside, it may look like silence, but inside it is strength. The kind of strength that does not shout, does not argue, and does not demand recognition. It simply remains firm, calm, unshaken. And once you develop that kind of inner control, you begin to realize something the Stoics understood thousands of years ago. The greatest victory in life is not over other people, it is over yourself.